Once there was a war like none other ever before, a war cloaked in darkness, lit only by the flash of flares and searchlights, the explosions of bombs, and the blaze of burning planes. For the first time in history, a war would be fought in the air and at night. What made it possible was a burst of technical innovation by scientists and engineers, spurred by the quest for victory and the fear of defeat. The remembrance of those who die in war is part of the promise made to those who agree to serve. But how can they be remembered if the circumstances in which they died become unknowable?
He was out to get us and we were out to get him. It was fair game. He was trying to kill us and we were trying to kill him.
A modern schoolboy looking at a suit of armor can imagine the Battle of Agincourt more vividly than he can imagine the trials of a World War II pilot if he's never seen the planes in which they flew. Before the war, the only regularly scheduled aircraft on transatlantic flights was the flying boat, because no one trusted airplanes enough to fly the Atlantic in anything that didn't float. 2 years into the war, planes routinely flew the Atlantic, literally in the thousands. Preserving all that change and innovation was and is impossible. But at war's end, little effort was made to preserve any of it. The Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum at Hamilton, Canada's International Airport is one such place of preservation, reconstruction, and remembrance.
But I do remember a stream of white smoke flowing away from that inboard engine. And very shortly, the wing broke away from the aircraft all by itself, went overhead, spiraled down, and the aircraft went upside down and spiraled down through the bomber stream. How it didn't strike other bombers, I don't know.
Each airplane type began as an idea, and the way in which these flying ideas followed one another marks an evolution that is only knowable if the aircraft themselves are preserved, not as static relics, but as flying machines. The weaknesses of each that led to the next evolutionary step can then be felt, seen, and appreciated. In the war, the decisive events often occurred miles from the action and had to be initiated many years before their importance became apparent. Guesses became decisions as to what planes would succeed and which would fail.
I can tell you that in 1944, our losses prior to that had been quite severe, and our losses continued to be severe.
Nowhere were these guesses more important than in deciding what planes would best prepare pilots to fly aircraft not yet off the drawing boards, with specifications as yet unknown. One wrong guess was the Fleet Fort, the only trainer built in Canada during the war that was of Canadian design. The Royal Canadian Air Force did not want to buy it, and their doubts proved valid. The Fleet Fort as a trainer flew so well and so easily that it proved unsuitable for the transition to combat aircraft.
Fleet Fort was an experiment as a basic trainer in which the armed forces at the time, they thought that the step from the Tiger Moss or the Cornells was a little bit too big going from them directly into the Harvard. So they came up with the idea that possibly an intermediate trainer would fit the bill and would help ease the transition in a little bit. But the experience showed that it really wasn't required. And the Fleet Fort and the Yales were pretty much switched over into the wireless trainer mode, in which the rear cockpit was stripped of all its controls, and they installed radios and such to train radio operators.
The workhorse of pilot training was the Harvard, named appropriately enough given its teaching role after Harvard University. It became the standard intermediate trainer for both the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan in Canada and the U.S. Army Air Force.
It was basically the airplane that prepared the pilots that were going to be mainly going onto the fighter aircraft, the high-performance airplanes like the Spitfire, the Mustang, Hurricanes, and other fighters of that type.
The Harvard, unlike the Fleet Fort, had enough bad habits to teach pilots to respect the high-performance fighters they would ultimately fly.
In 1939, the Canadian government desperately wanted to avoid suffering the kind of massive casualties that had produced a conscription crisis in the First World War. They believed that probably the easiest way to do this was to, first of all, emphasize air training in the safe skies of Canada.
With airfields located beyond the reach of any enemy, Canada became what President Franklin Delano Roosevelt would call the aerodrome of democracy. The British Commonwealth Air Training Plan trained the air crews of the New Zealand, Australian, South African, Canadian, and British Air Forces. Training fields were established in more than 50 Canadian cities and towns from coast to coast. Pilots and other air crew had to be trained in carefully graduated steps if they were to effectively operate high-performance combat aircraft. Most pilots began with the Tiger Moth, a peacetime aircraft on which they were introduced to basic flying skills.
Those are my best times, really, I think, because I had a great time flying the little old biplanes, learning how to fly them. And they were exciting times for me because I was an 18-year-old at the time.
Very few of the young men from the Commonwealth had ever flown before. In a matter of months, they passed from a state of total ignorance to moving huge machines at night in conditions so crowded both in the air and on the ground that no commercial operation would tolerate them for a moment. The key to this transition, once the basic skills were mastered, was the Harvard.
Fairly high performance. It's nowhere near as high performance as some of the fighter airplanes, but it has the same type of characteristics where it's a little bit unstable, quite demanding to fly, especially on the runways, and it has a pretty nasty stall spin characteristic, but otherwise it's a very nice airplane to fly. The student would be in the front, the instructor would be in the back, except when they were doing instrument flying, there's a canvas hood in the rear seat that would cover up the rear seat so that the student couldn't see outside, and they would be flying by the instruments in the back seat, and then the instructor in the front could release the hood, and then the student would be going on visual references again.
The Harvard had been created as a trainer for war, in contrast to the Tiger Moth, which made its training debut during peacetime. The Bolingbroke, Canada's version of the Bristol Blenheim, was a failure as a medium bomber. Too slow, too cumbersome, carrying too light a bomb load. But after this harsh judgment rendered by the rigors of war, Canada would build 687 of them. The Bolingbroke, after being retired from Europe, supplied 8 RCAF maritime squadrons on anti-submarine patrol. The rest were destined to become training planes used to teach bombing, gunnery, and wireless under combat conditions, for which it proved to be ideal.
The British licensed Fairchild Company, aircraft company in Canada, Longueuil, Quebec, to produce the Bristol Blenheim into a Canadian-made aircraft. At that time, there were some modifications made to the aircraft. Originally, it had a short nose. Under changes at 1939, they installed a longer nose to accommodate the navigator and bombardier. It was used as a trainer inland to train pilots from the British Commonwealth training program. But unknown to many, it served on the east and west coast and the Aleutian Islands. But this particular aircraft will be restored to the 119 Hamilton Tiger Squadron, which served in Yarmouth, Nova Scotia, on submarine patrol in the St. Lawrence.
Like some aging, determined vet, the Bolingbroke retired to life as a trainer, but kept finding ways to get back to the fighting.
There was 21 merchant ships sunk in the Gulf, awaiting convoy duty to England. 119 Hamilton Tiger Squadron served well. They got a few submarines at the time.
More than simply restoring an aircraft, the Bolingbroke project has become a personal memorial. Wayne had been working at the museum for 6 years when a gift from his mother changed his life.
As I was retrieving these aircraft, I was handed a scrapbook by my mother at the time, which I'd never seen. And in that scrapbook, I found a picture of my father, who had trained in a Bolingbroke at Jarvis.
During the war, Wayne's father served with both the RCAF and RAF, ultimately being transferred to Tunis in North Africa.
In December of 1943, he was shot down over the Med, and nothing was ever found. 1 ration box, 1 seat cushion, and an oil slick. That's all.
For individuals like Wayne Reddy, the Bolingbroke Restoration Project is more than assembling a piece of our past.
This is a very, very important part of our history and our life as we know it today. All things that are benefited from today come from the fact of what they did then. So every aircraft that Canadians flew, every artifact we can find is so important to make sure that the people who come behind us will always realize of what they did to be to where we are today. It's so important.
The scourge of every U-boat was the Kanso, which the Americans called the Catalina. It is seen here in colors as a firefighting aircraft. Operationally, it was painted the color of the North Atlantic. Many believe it was the Kanso with the Liberator whose increasing range made it possible to reach the center of the Atlantic from either coast that helped to tip the Battle of the Atlantic in favor of the Allies. This Kanso will be restored to the colors and markings of the 165 RCAF Bomber Reconnaissance Squadron and is dedicated to the memory of Flight Lieutenant David Hornell. Bud Hornell, a Manitoban flying a Kanso flying boat on reconnaissance, spotted a German submarine. The two exchanged fire and both were hit, but Hornell pressed the attack, sustaining more damage before sinking the U-boat with 2 well-placed depth charges on either side of it. Hornell had to ditch, and the shattered hull sank immediately, leaving 8 men to occupy 1 raft. 3 would die in the 24 hours before rescue came. One of the dead was David Ernest Hornell, posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross. The memory of pilots like Bud Hornell comes vividly alive when the Kanso skims the wave tops, evoking memories of searching for the wolves of the sea more than 50 years ago. The training planes of the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan were painted a bright yellow so they could be easily spotted in the air and on the ground, where a large number flown by students ended up. Combat aircraft were camouflaged black to blend into the night if looking up, and contoured with brown and green to blend with the ground if looking down. In addition to training and combat roles, aircraft were being pressed into service for roles not even contemplated in the First World War. The world's most successful aircraft in terms of longevity is the DC-3, or in its military designation, C-47, the Dakota. Since it made its appearance in 1935, more than 13,000 have been built, and as recently as 1990, 3,500 Dakotas were still flying worldwide. The Goonie Birds, as they were affectionately called in their wartime role, provided cargo and personnel delivery, glider towing, and parachute drops. They were to the war in the air what the Jeep was on the ground. This particular one is also something special. The second highest lifetime flying miles of all operational Dakotas, 82,000 hours of airtime, and 12 million miles, the equivalent of flying around the Earth 450 times. The DC-3 from the museum was built in 1939, so in terms of remembrance, it is a working reminder of the three RCAF Dakota squadrons of World War II. The DC-3 was a civilian design, which, like so many men and women, went to war and then returned to civilian life, something very few aircraft were able to do. The B-25 Mitchell bomber was the workhorse of the American Air Force, particularly in the Pacific. Not designed to take off and land from carriers, 25 of them were launched from the U.S. aircraft carrier Hornet in April 1942 in the first raid on Tokyo. Those that survived and weren't shot down flew on to land in China. The raid was a token one, meant mainly to jolt Japanese morale only 5 months after Pearl Harbor.
Light bomber, attack bomber, fighter, reconnaissance, and transportation, flying people in and dropping them behind enemy lines. Well, the B-25 was one of the most versatile Second World War aircraft in the fighter role and the bomber role that we had, and including little things like the carrier takeoff for the first raid on Japanese territory. It's really an airplane that has not been replaced in its role or couldn't be replaced in its role during the war. At max power, it would certainly wind up to 300, and that in its day was quite a speed for this size of an aircraft. Certainly not in the category of necessarily the Mosquito or the Hurricane or the Spitfire, but very, very quick for the size and weight. This aircraft, again, was up to 30,000 pounds gross, and that is a big payload.
The A-26 Invader made its appearance at the end of World War II. Comparing it to the B-25, it provides an excellent example of how aircraft improved and evolved under the pressures of war. While almost the same size as the B-25, it flew 100 miles an hour faster and carried 25% more bombs. This one was flown by Captain Chester Mathieu of Ottawa in Indochina for the French from 1951 to 1954. It represented a new level of engineering sophistication. One of the most enduring symbols of remembrance is the Harvard, which dotted the Canadian skies during the war.
The snarl of the Harvard is the sound of the propeller. When you get up to the higher RPM for which you'll be doing takeoff and climb, the tips of the propeller are approaching the speed of sound, and it's actually the shock wave off the tips of the propeller that is what makes the snarl.
Our whole reason for being is that it's alive. The aircraft fly, you can hear them, you can see them, there's smoke, there's oil, there's hydraulic fluid. There is a place for a static museum. A lot of those aircraft are one of a kind, and I think that when we get down to one of a kind, that maybe those airplanes should be preserved in a static state. The mandate of the museum is to preserve these aircraft in flying conditions so people can see them in the air, which is their natural state. Two of us back in 1971 decided to buy an airplane, high-performance type airplane, and experience the thrill of flying a World War II type combat airplane. We looked around looking for a Spitfire. Of course, everybody wanted a Spitfire. That was the epitome of a World War II fighter as far as we were concerned. We found this Firefly in Australia that, in researching it, found out that there was actually one in North America that was for sale. Raised the money and bought the first airplane, which is the Firefly, the same as the one that you see behind me here. We thought it'd be one airplane, go and have some fun. But as we got into it, we realized that nobody had preserved aircraft of this type in Canada. Any aircraft of this type that were in Canada were ending up in the United States or Great Britain. From that point, we had another 1 or 2 aircraft donated, and that's how it started. It was almost like Topsy. Nothing planned that way.
Then in early 1993, disaster struck a near-fatal blow to the efforts of Dennis Bradley and his colleagues.
On a fateful Sunday night, part of our hangar caught on fire. It wasn't caught until the morning, and it was a serious blow to the museum. We lost 5 airplanes, plus all our records, archives, spare parts. It was a real downer, if you like. And I don't think we emotionally have ever recovered from it. We lost the Hawker Hurricane, we lost the Spitfire, TBM Avenger, an Oster, Stinson 105. The Hurricane and the Spitfire were going to be part of our memorial flight to fly alongside the Lancaster. A lot of work had gone into those airplanes. We were very, very proud of them. It was a disastrous fire, and thank heavens, part of the hangar where the Lancaster was stored it was a concrete block wall and acted as a fire break, and the Lancaster itself was not damaged.
Unlike other museums designed simply to preserve the past, the emphasis on machines that work can lead to unexpected complications. The creation of a museum that features 1940s technology that actually works presents unique problems, not just to make them function, but to make them operate with today's specifications.
I think one of the biggest challenges is making sure that the aircraft, as far as the flying airplanes and the restoration products, meet the standard of Transport Canada as far as meeting the Canadian aviation regulations. And sourcing parts can be a big problem. And the airplanes tend to have a mind of their own. They can break, as you know, during some of the filming at any time. We know that the airplanes are in good shape, and we do a repetitive maintenance schedule with the airplanes that meet the Canadian aviation regulations.
An equally versatile British-designed aircraft, the Lysander, succeeded both in training and in war by occupying a special niche in each. The short takeoff and landing used an elaborate system of slats and large flaps to enable the aircraft to land and to take off on unprepared landing strips in battlefield conditions. It was the aircraft of choice for the transportation of agents into occupied Europe, often returning with escapees, including Allied airmen. Under certain conditions, it could take off in as little as 165 yards, while its slow flying speed made it perfect for towing targets that supplied gunnery practice for trainees.
After the war, some of these airplanes were used as crop sprayers across the plains. This one was found in Saskatchewan, and when they found it, it had a tree growing up through it, and it was derelict. A farmer had bought it after the war for whatever reason, usually for the fuel in the tanks. And that's how we found it. There's a group of us who come out on Thursdays and Tuesdays and during the weekends, and my thing is fabric work. But I am sort of the coordinator of the aircraft, and we have many people on different parts of the airplane doing all sorts of things at all times. If we have an original part that's broken, we have to reverse engineer it, supply drawings, get a sample of the material, and then we construct the part.
The theory of working on this airplane, these airplanes, is the same as any other airplane. They have to meet a certain standard of safety. We're lucky in this area that we use a lot of volunteers from industry. There's a local steel plants, and we get a lot of retired machinists, inspectors, you name it. We have people that do all kinds of jobs in industry that we take advantage of. We find ourselves like Tom Sawyer putting these people to work on our projects, and it's really rewarding.
Well, right now we're to the point where we're putting fabric on the surfaces, as you see. The engine is away to an American shop being overhauled. The engine was supplied to us by the National Museum in Ottawa, and we're looking at 2 years at this point.
There's no pressurization whatsoever in these old airplanes. That's one of the reasons they last so long, is because there's no stress from the pressurization. Modern airliners, well, for starters, they have air conditioning. They have a great deal of power. They have a nose wheel, makes them easier to maneuver on the ground. It gives them more versatility for taking off and landing in strong winds. When you move the controls in a modern airplane, you're actually moving against a spring, so they tend to be a little lighter and the controls are much more effective. This airplane with its tail wheel is limited when it's really windy, as you probably noticed today taxiing around in it. The controls are moved by muscle power, and they're not nearly as effective as they are with more modern airplanes. But it's a great airplane, nothing wrong with it.
The Lancaster bomber was built for war, a fact which sealed its fate once peace came. Of all 7,300 of them built, 400 in Canada, there are only 2 left in the world still flying.
We always have fire guards, as called, people standing by with fire extinguishers in case things start to burn on us. With one of these levers, turn that on, which admits fuel to the engine, and press the appropriate one of the 4 starter buttons. In fact, mechanically turns the engine over, much the same as the starter in a car. And in the event that you lose an engine, you can go through the gate by moving the throttle sideways and pushing it, as we say, all the way to the wall. It's incredibly noisy. I've heard it described as being similar to 3 mad monks saying high mass and high-pitched voices. I fly a 747 for a living, and to begin with, there is no real comparison. As I mentioned before, there is absolutely nothing automatic about this airplane. It's what we as pilots would refer to as a muscle machine, only in the sense that it does take a lot of muscle to manhandle it around the sky. It literally takes 4 of us here in the flight deck of the airplane to handle both the controls and the systems. The only air conditioning is by opening the windows. Incredibly hot and uncomfortable. It is not a user-friendly airplane as people would describe them now, but that it was never designed to be. And we have attempted, insofar as possible, to keep it close to the original. We have not installed any creature comforts. The only basic additions are those which, for safety reasons such as communication and navigation, are insisted upon by Transport Canada in order to enable us to fly the airplane safely in the air traffic system as we now find it. It is a pleasure to fly. It is and can be a very nimble airplane. It can be flown very gracefully, if you will, There are not that many things, however, that you can do with an airplane of this size to display it. We are told by audiences for whom we have performed that the airplane flies beautifully and certainly sounds very attractive in the air, certainly different from most other airplanes that you see in North America now.
The differences in American and British design and the philosophy behind each are also on display at the museum. The Americans stressed the ease and speed of construction and maintenance on the American-built Harvard. The fuselage is removable, making electrical and other maintenance fast and easy. The British, conditioned by a shortage of pilots during the Battle of Britain, had different concerns regarding airplane design.
It was what we now describe as a single-pilot airplane. That is, everything around the pilot was designed to be reached conveniently by the one pilot. That is, the trims, which you can see here, the flaps up and down, the wheels up and down, the bomb door lever, which you will probably not be able to see, which is out of your sight down below my left hip, the throttles here, the propeller controls here, fuel controls, etc., as you can see, are all within very easy reach of the one person sitting in this seat. The control column, which is quite obvious, is original. The instrument flying panel directly ahead of the pilot is almost totally original, with the exception of one instrument which was added to bring it up to modern standard. And off to the side, the one modern navigational instrument which we possess. When the airplane is up at the upper end of its speed range, I'd say it's probably equivalent to bench pressing maybe 100 pounds odd or something like that. At the lower end of the speed range, particularly when you're flying in the airport circuit, it can actually be very, very light and docile. The exertion comes particularly when you're flying formation, which requires constant movements of the controls, constant movements of the throttles. The airplane does not respond as quickly as do many of the lighter, more agile fighter and trainer type airplanes, and it can be a really good workout. The airplane was, for its day, a perfectly conventional four-engine heavy bomber. It is the Canadian-built version of an English design. It has a wingspan of just over 100 feet and a length of approximately 75 feet. During the war, they were flown to a maximum all-up weight of 66,000 pounds. At the museum here, for various reasons, we fly the aircraft only to 53,000 pounds. It is relative to modern airplanes. There is absolutely nothing automatic about the airplane. And with the exception of a few of the systems, such as communication and navigation, most of the original mechanical innards of the airplane, so to speak, still exist, just as they did in World War II.
Whatever judgment the perils of combat failed to deliver to warplanes was often delivered by peace. The aircraft of World War II had qualities perfected during the war, which proved useful in peace. But some, like the high-performance fighters, were simply war machines quickly rendered obsolete as faster, higher performance, and more deadly aircraft were created. The Lancaster, with unmatched flying and operational performance, could carry a 22,000-pound bomb and could, when called upon, take evasive action that would escape the machine guns of enemy fighters.
Originally, in the wartime configuration of the bomber aircraft, it was crewed by 7 people. The British in those days flew the airplane basically as a single-pilot airplane, so there was one gentleman in the nose of the aircraft who was both the bomb aimer, also doubled as the nose gunner. In the cockpit or flight deck here, there was the single pilot, an engineer, a navigator, and a radio operator, and 2 more gunners, the mid-upper gunner and the tail gunner, who were down at the rear of the aircraft.
It was contingent on the rear gunner never to drop his guard. So you were constantly looking out into the blackness and hoping that you would see nothing, but once you did, then to take that evasive action and save not only yourself, but the aircraft and the crew.
They come at you in 2 ways then, either from your level, from behind, or from underneath behind. And we were attacked on one occasion from almost above. He dove at us from above, coming in from way behind. And the gunners, of course, had clear vision of that. And the tail gunner called for evasive action, which was that old favorite term, corkscrew. And the aircraft had to do some violent evasive action.
Once you saw an enemy aircraft, instead of engaging him immediately, you would instruct the captain with starboard go or port go, whichever direction you wanted him to drop the airplane.
And I remember seeing tracer fire passing over the port wing as I was doing my dive to port before changing to the dive into the starboard and then rolling to come up starboard.
It was very, very quickly done. It had to be quickly done because that enemy aircraft was coming in fairly fast. And when that aircraft would drop, it would go into what we call a corkscrew.
But I remember seeing the tracer fire coming over that wing because this fellow was pooping at us. Pardon the term, but that was a term that we all understood. On that occasion, everybody was firing at that same aircraft, and I think that aircraft was destroyed. But before we could report our incident to debriefing back at base afterwards, some other crew had claimed that aircraft. So I guess there were a number of aircraft pooping at him because he made himself quite obvious sitting back there behind us over the target area.
And just as we were going in on that bombing run, right behind us, a little bit above, just slightly above us, an ME-110, a Messerschmitt 110, right in the bomber stream, right over the target area, which was rather unusual because the flak is coming up pretty heavy. But there he was. What happens? Your bowel turns to water from fear.
Another occasion we had to go into evasive action when the gunner spotted somebody coming up from below. And that was away from the target into the night. And good old cat's eye vision was necessary, and I could yaw the aircraft back and forth somewhat to let him have a good look below. But on one occasion there was one sitting there, and I don't think he ever made an attempt to come up under us, but we went into a violent evasive action on that case too.
Many of the most heroic deeds of Canadian airmen took place in Lancasters. Whether it was Johnny Fauquier hovering for more than an hour at the destruction of Peenemünde, thus delaying the introduction of the V-1 for 3 months, or Andrew Charles Minarski displaying heroic compassion towards a member of his crew. In June 1944, Minarski's Lancaster was shot down by a German fighter. With the plane ablaze, Minarski tried repeatedly and in vain to free his rear gunner, jammed into his turret. When Minarski finally jumped, his chute was on fire. Eyewitnesses on the ground said his descent to his death was like a Roman candle blazing across the night sky. Miraculously, the gunner lived to tell the story of Minarski's bravery. Minarski received his Victoria Cross posthumously. But preserving the true site of Minarski's heroism grows more and more costly. The work of preserving the technological past, primarily the planes of World War II, becomes more necessary and more difficult with the passage of time. The rarer the planes, the more expensive they become.
I guess the single challenge that we are faced with is funding. We can find parts to keep them flying. If we can't find the parts, in a lot of cases we can make the parts. When these aircraft were first retired from the service, the price of them was very, very low. It's gone up to the point now where certain consumable parts are back in production again because the prices are so high. Our biggest problem, and it's an ongoing problem, and it's a problem not just our museum faces, but virtually every museum in the world faces, is funding. There's no money at the government for this type of operation. If there is, it's very, very limited. So we have to do what we can do, whether it be display the airplanes at air displays, or have functions in the hangar, or encourage people to visit. We do whatever we have to do to try and keep the cash flow. The cost of operating these airplanes is, to give you an example, in 1972 to overhaul a Merlin engine was $4,500. Today, the cost is over $60,000 US. The Lancaster we have here represents an investment of volunteer time and corporate donations, probably in the neighborhood of $3 million. That was in from 1977 to 1988 during its restoration period. Today would be much, much higher than that, and I'm not so sure that the corporations that were involved at that time would be able to do it with the economy the way it is today. So I think we were lucky to be able to, we're at the right place at the right time to put this airplane in the air, and it certainly has been a rewarding experience. We don't have an active acquisition program as such, because we do have 2 aircraft being restored, 1 more waiting to be restored, and as aircraft continue to increase in price, where we paid in 1984 $385,000 for the Hawker Hurricane, today on today's market it's $1.3 million US. If this continues, it's going to become more and more difficult to add some of the more exotic airplanes to the collection. I guess we will continue to work with corporate donors and individuals who like to see these airplanes preserved, and have the aircraft donated is probably the only way we're going to be able to add to the collection some of these exotic airplanes we want. However, things happen in funny ways. Back in 1996, the spring of '96, we acquired the PBY Catalina, Kanso. It was donated by 2 of our members. Right out of the blue, we didn't expect it to happen, so these things happen, and I hope will continue to happen.
I've been doing this now for something over 10 years, and I hope to have a few good years left in me yet, even perhaps after I retire from active flying. But what can I say? It's one of only 2 in the world, and it has been exactly that, a real privilege. Every time we have some senior gentleman come through the hangar to look at the airplane, or to visit us at air shows, etc., whenever anyone says, "I used to fly these," I have long since learned to pay attention, because I have picked up innumerable little things which are basically pearls of wisdom, I guess best put, but which are not to be found in any of the manuals, of course. And the sad part is that the calendar is obviously taking its toll, and many of these gentlemen are simply no longer with us. And it's my job, both as a pilot and certainly as the instructor on the airplane, to pick up as much of this as I can, and within the context of our modern rules and regulations, to pass on this knowledge and technique to the gentlemen who will in fact be my successors.
Nothing at the Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum better illustrates its purpose than the Lancaster. The aircrew of Bomber Command sustained the highest casualty rate of any Allied service arm. With the Lancaster, an important part of the collective memory concerning the events of World War II and their sacrifice is preserved. Without it, they are lost. Words and pictures cannot preserve the experience of the thing itself, which is the aim of all remembrance.